I am Kendra Petty. I am an executive vice president for a national firm, but I am also not just a survivor of a tremendous amount of trauma and tragedy in my life. I've learned to thrive in life in spite of my trauma. My brother was 10. We were very, very close. He was my hero. He was my protector. We were always together. And when I was 8 and he was 10, he was killed in a tragic accident in front of me, a very violent, gruesome accident. He died protecting me, and that made my mother go even madder. Her abuse ramped up considerably, really directed towards me. She was very physically abusive, very mentally, emotionally, verbally abusive. Every day was 911, hair on fire. The death of my brother drove my parents to more fighting, and eventually my father left. My mother remarried the neighbor across the street. The neighbor across the street's wife died, and the wife was my mother's best friend. So within a very short amount of time, my mother lost her son, her husband, and her best friend. The mental illness that she already dealt with, again, just continued down deeper into this further abyss of mental illness and anger and uncontrollable rage. Of all that loss from my mother and my stepfather, who lost his wife, and the mother to his 2 girls, they started a church in our home. This church morphed into this extreme cult. It was a cult that led to even more abuse, more physical abuse, beatings in the name of God, strange rituals, praying in tongues, casting the devil out, laying hands on people to cast the devil out, a lot of dancing and screaming in tongues. We weren't allowed to go to the doctor because if we weren't well or if we were injured, they would pray over us in the name of God, and we were supposed to be healed. So no proper medical care. We were cut off from the rest of the world. We went to a Christian school. So really all of our lives during that period was just God, the Bible. We weren't allowed to show emotion. We weren't allowed to associate with people from outside the church. All I wanted to do was be with my brother that day and go fishing. So I begged my mom. She made my brother promise that he would get me there safely and then back home safely for a birthday party that I had later that afternoon. He promised he would. We were elated to go fishing and spend the day together and be outside. We had to cross a highway to get there, and I guess my mother felt like because the babysitter was with us, who was a teenage girl, that we would be safe. So we crossed the highway, fished all morning into the afternoon, and then it was time to go back across the highway to go to the birthday party. And I begged the babysitter to go with us, and she said, no, you'll be fine. And my brother was supposed to come back across the highway after he dropped me off so that he could continue fishing. So we were prepared to cross the highway. We were holding hands, and he ran, holding my hand, and I got halfway across the highway with him, and I got scared, and I broke free from him. I ran back. I turned around, and he was standing on the other side of the highway, waving at me that it was safe to come, and I saw a giant black sedan barreling down the highway towards him, and he was on the edge of the highway, and I was trying to tell him to look for the car and to move out of the way, and he was telling me that it was safe, and just communicating with each other but not communicating. We were looking at each other in the eyes when he just got absolutely obliterated by that car. It was the most grotesque thing I think I could ever see. He did not die immediately, although he never regained consciousness. He got hit, went up onto the car slammed on the brakes, he rolled off, he landed on his head. It took a huge piece of his scalp off all the way down to the skull, and he was not conscious ever again. And it was just chaotic at that point. I ran across the highway screaming for help, screaming for him to get up. A woman that was in a different car got out and said, "Is that your brother?" 'Cause I was jumping all over the highway and screaming and begging him to get up. And she said, "Is that your brother?" I said, "Yes." And she sent me away to go get my mother. And I think it was really just to get me away from the scene. I ran home and couldn't find my mother. She wasn't in the house. My baby brother was asleep on the bed. I never really knew where my mother was, couldn't ever really find her. But I went to the lady across the street, my mom's best friend, who later passed of cancer. I went to her house, and she then got neighbors. I guess they found my mother. They took her to the hospital. But eventually, I got to the hospital. And when I was in the waiting room, the police were questioning me about what happened. And I could see doctors and nurses running in and out with all kinds of machines. And I knew my brother was there. And when we first got there, I saw my parents in a room with a doctor. And he was giving them shots. And I assumed, in hindsight, that it was probably shots to calm them down. But they never saw me. I never spoke to them at the hospital. I was with a neighbor, spoke to the police, was interviewed by the police, and then I was sent to another neighbor's house for the rest of the afternoon and evening. And then later that night, they finally took me home, and, the whole evening and afternoon, I was sick to my stomach, worried about my brother. When I got home, there was a lot of people in the house. The house was full. Dad was laying on the couch crying. My mom was sitting beside him. They eventually got up and took me into the bedroom and told me my brother had passed. That event, losing my brother, who was the good kid, he wanted to be a preacher when he grew up. When he grew up, he was kind. That death and that event broke my family apart. And of course, I blamed myself. My whole life, I blamed myself. And that's part of my healing process, is try to work through that and forgive myself. A lot of people say, well, at 8 years old, you're a child, you can't possibly be responsible. But I look back and I think there were so many things that I could have done differently and he would still be alive. So working through that, but I immediately developed night terrors after his death. And those night terrors have lasted my whole life. And they, for a very long time, for decades, they were very violent. In my sleep, run out of my house, run out of my hotel room. I would injure myself. Through this healing process, they're not completely gone, but they have definitely dissipated by probably about 85%, which is phenomenal. I thought I would never be able to get there. So that's all a work in progress in terms of forgiving myself and trying to move on from that. My mom and stepfather's focus centered on the Old Testament, so it was just some really kind of bizarre rituals that would happen. But they started a church in our house. And this church grew in our house. It grew and grew and grew until it outgrew our house. And then we rented maybe a storefront and a retail place. And it grew and grew and grew. And then we rented a small church, grew and grew and grew until we eventually built a bigger church. At home, it was even more bizarre and even more intense. And I don't know that my stepfather was the preacher at this church for a long time. And then we finally got big enough that they hired pastor and preacher. But at home, my mom and stepdad's interpretation of the Bible was not right, in my opinion. I was already being beaten by my mom on the regular, but now there were even more beatings in the name of God, and they were very violent. They were very violent beatings. And when I was younger, my mom used to choke me till I'd black out and beat me. But as I got bigger, the chokings were less, and it was more the beatings. But it was beatings with just anything she could get her hands on. She had a whole regimen of things she would use to beat me. But my stepfather made paddles. He managed a chain of grocery stores, and from the wooden pallets in the grocery stores, he would break those apart and he would cut them, and he would cut them in different sizes because there were 4 kids and we were all different ages, and he would drill holes in them so that the wind would go through them and they would move faster and hurt more, I guess. And they would line them up on the fireplace, all the different sizes, as a threat. I cut my leg open on a barbed wire fence when I was 17, and it had to have been 8 inches across and another 4 inches. It was like a check mark. And they prayed over me. It was very deep. It was bleeding. It was horrible. And that's just one example of many times that it was injured, or some of us that got sick. They prayed over it, and they didn't take me to the hospital. There were also strange rituals where my mother or stepfather or both of them felt there was things that were secular or that were possessed by the devil. There'd be a whole ritual where they bring those things into the living room and they would put them in a pile and dance around them and scream and pray in tongues and cast the devil out of those things and then smash them with their feet and hammers, just various things over the years. It was just a bizarre way to grow up. And we weren't allowed to associate with anybody outside the church. So, I had friends at school, but until I became, I think, a senior, I really was allowed to go do things with them or go spend time at their house. It was all a very controlling environment, and we weren't allowed to watch the TV. I think we were allowed maybe an hour a week of cartoons, and no radio, absolutely no radio, only Christian music, no Teen Beat or whatever the magazines are, Vogue, none of that. When I left Oklahoma, I moved to New York City, lived there for 8 years, went to university, graduated, really focused on building my career. I started in the industry that I'm still in today. In that climb of the corporate ladder, I married a woman who, unbeknownst to me, was and I found myself in yet another extremely abusive marriage. She broke my bones on a number of occasions. I have scars all over my body from her abuse. I had to have her arrested. It took me 6 years to unwind from that marriage, and it was devastating to me because I lost my wife and my stepdaughter from that marriage. So it took me many years to move on from losing my family and move on from all that tremendous abuse. On the heels of my divorce, I took the number 2 position at a firm under the CEO. It's a firm that owned a handful of companies, and I oversaw a couple of those companies. This was an attempt to continue to move up the corporate ladder, and build my career. And in the first year, things were not right at this company. It took me some time to really start uncovering that this company was involved in organized crime. And I would go to the ownership and the CEO with things that I would find that just were not above board. And I would present it to them and say, I don't understand, and we need to change this and do it this way. Not really understanding in the beginning that they were part of an organized crime organization, and that's why those things were the way they were. This corporate company was involved in money laundering and pay-to-play, bribery, paying for contracts, tax evasion. I mean, it was a whole rampant. There was violence involved as well. They murdered a CEO. They tried to murder me about 2 years into this. We were being investigated by the FBI. I found listening devices in my office and remnants of one in my car. I had a gentleman that I had brought from the industry who I knew to work for me and run the West Coast for me, was with me when I found the first listening device, the one in my office. And he flipped out. What kind of company have you brought me to? That's when things really started going sideways, downhill for me. About 3 months later, I started getting really sick. I could not figure out why I was so sick. My skin turned gray. My eyes got real puffy and popped out of my head. I got horrible headaches. I got sores in my ears, in my mouth, down my throat. I lost my voice. I was very raspy. My joints hurt really bad. My muscles hurt really bad. I mean, there's a whole array of symptoms that I couldn't explain. And I would walk around the office and people were like, what is the matter with you, Kendra? And I would say, I have no idea, but I feel so sick. And I eventually started realizing that when I was in my office, it was worse. When I would travel or go to a conference room for meetings, it would dissipate some. So I felt like it was something in my office. Looked around my office, thinking it was in my vents, thinking it's mold in my vents, never thinking there were poisons in my office. Couldn't find anything in my vents. And I traveled a lot. So when I would travel, it would dissipate and then I wouldn't think about it. But I had come back and I was spending like a month not doing a lot of traveling. And so I was in the office every day, in and out for meetings. And then I started getting really sick. It was always very cold in my office. So I kept a space heater underneath my desk and I had to wear scarves around my neck because I have short hair. It was so cold in my office. Only my office. I would have to go to the ladies' room to warm up. So one day I'm in my office and I have my space heater going and I drop something and it rolls under my desk. And I go under my desk to get it. And I look up and there are pods underneath my desk. And I immediately know that's why I'm sick. And so I get some tissue and I pull one of the pods down and I just go into a panic. And I call another guy that I work with who, both of these gentlemen are still very good friends of mine. I call this other gentleman. They're both in my book. I changed their names. And I tell him what I found. I said, this is why I'm sick. I know this is why I've been sick. I had my assistant search the entire office with me. I showed her and I said, what the hell are these doing under my desk? There were two of them and I found one on my refrigerator in my office. Those pods could have been put anywhere, but they were right up under my desk, right above the space heater. Whatever poisons were in them were getting heated up every day. I felt like the right side of my face was just going to burn off. My right eyeball I felt was going to burn out of my socket for weeks and weeks and weeks until I found those. And so I had my assistant search the whole office with me. We could not find one more pod, not one pod. And so I knew that they were put there intentionally. And I panicked. And I had a corporate apartment in another city. And so I had to go to a conference. I left. I went to the conference. I was so sick at that conference. So sick. Then went to my corporate apartment in this other city. And I was also dating someone that lived in Charlotte, North Carolina. I went there to try to heal and figure this out. And then I would just spend time in my corporate apartment in Chicago. And I didn't go back to that other office for over a month. When I did, I sat down with the vice president of HR and I told her what I found. And we had worked together in a former company. She was really kind of responsible for bringing me to this company. She cried. And I didn't know if she was crying because she felt bad for me or she thought I was crazy. But I said, this was intentional. There's nowhere else in the office. I have been very, very sick. I'm still sick. The symptoms dissipated, but then they would increase. And what happened was I started finding these poisons and these pods elsewhere. They were in my car, in my house, in my home. I was unknowingly ingesting them, wearing them on my clothes, inhaling them. It made me horrifically sick. As I found them and I removed them, I had brain fog. And so I was just trying to figure out, I knew I needed to leave. I was too afraid to call the police. I was like, the police will never believe me. And so I called an attorney friend of mine. I said, I've got to see you. And I flew up and I had lunch with him. I said, you're never going to believe this, but here's what's happened. And he said, of course I believe it. This kind of stuff happens all the time. He referred me to a couple of attorneys in the city that I lived, and I went and met with each one of them. And as I sat down with them, same thing. I said, "You're never going to believe what I have to tell you." And I told them the story, and they said, "Yeah, I believe you. This corporate sabotage happens all the time, as does organized crime, apparently." Once I removed myself from all the toxins and poisons and worked on a plan, an exit strategy, I couldn't just quit, because as the number two in a company like this, those positions aren't, in my industry, they are not just available everywhere. So I had to figure out my exit strategy, because my career was critical to me. And about 4 months later, I developed a whole new different set of symptoms. I lost half my hair. I lost a lot of weight. I went down to 92 pounds. I developed just a whole array of different kinds of symptoms. And so I was sick all over again, a different kind of sick than the chemical poisoning, but sick all over again. And I started going to a doctor trying to figure it out. And I was also getting a lot of infections. Those chemicals just wiped out my immune system, so I couldn't fight anything off. So I was always in the ER, this infection or that infection. And the gentleman that I mentioned that I called had to take me a number of times to the ER because I was so sick. And so in trying to chase down what was wrong with me now, because I felt like I wasn't being poisoned, because I was staying in hotels, different hotels, and I'm switching hotels every couple of nights. And so I felt like they couldn't know where I was, so it couldn't be poisons anymore. And what happened was I developed something called Graves' disease. And Graves' disease is an autoimmune disease. It's a hyperthyroidism that is not curable. You can put it in remission, but it's not curable. You can get it in a few different ways. It can be genetic, which it wasn't for me, or there can be triggers. And two of the biggest triggers for Graves is exposure to chemicals and multiple infections. And I had both. And so I developed Graves, and I got very sick. And I worked with a lot of different doctors. We finally defined it. We put me on medication to try to balance it out. But it was very difficult for me for 12 years to keep it in remission. It kept coming in and out. And so I was always fighting the symptoms. I left that firm within a year. I joined the firm that I'm with today. I've been with that firm for now over 13 and a half years. 7.5 years after my exposure to chemicals, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. The gestation period for cancer when exposed to chemicals is 7 to 8 years. And I had always told my friends, kind of jokingly, because cancer doesn't run in my family, years before I got diagnosed, I said, if I ever get cancer, just thinking about chemicals and what chemicals could do to you, if I ever get cancer, it's going to be because of those whatever chemicals poisons they were exposing me to. I never in a million years thought I would get diagnosed with cancer. Never, ever, ever. And so it was a shock. And I went through cancer, and I'd spent 7.5 years with this firm trying to build back my career and trying to build back my health. And I was sick constantly, but I continued to travel. I continued to work a lot to stay successful and continue to climb that ladder with this new company I was with and prove myself. Just as I felt like I was getting a bit better, then I got diagnosed with cancer. It has been a challenging time in my adulthood, but I'm very grateful to be alive. I'm lucky to be alive. As I mentioned, one of the CEOs was murdered, so tried to murder me. So I am very, very lucky, as it says on my palm. This is my daily reminder that I'm alive and that I'm very fortunate and lucky to be alive. So after 6 years of working on healing my heart, my mind, my soul, forgiving myself and moving forward, opening my heart to love, I have an amazing life. I'm not just a survivor. I haven't just survived all these horrific things. I've learned to thrive in my life as well, and I live a life of peace and happiness and joy. So part of my healing process was also, I knew that I needed to write down my life's events. And I had this voice that I've been hearing for a 1.5 years through my healing process. Write it down, write it down. It was my inner voice telling me to write it down. And for years, people had told me to write a book, and I would say, no, I don't have time. It's not in my wheelhouse. Who's going to read it? But when I started the healing process, I realized that me surviving so much and really learning a path to healing for myself and learning to thrive in life, there could be a lot of things that I could share with people and they could potentially benefit from it. So I decided finally I needed to write it down, and I hired a ghostwriter. It took us 3 years to write this book. She is a published author herself. She's also ghostwritten a number of books that have been published. She used to work for Simon & Schuster and Random House. She was responsible for not just publishing books with them, but also taking books from books to movies and books to TV series. Her biggest claim to fame is that she found Legally Blonde in the trash and helped make it into a book and then into a movie. So she really knew her stuff. So I hired her. It took us 3 years to write this book. I never knew how, number one, difficult it would be, but number two, how cathartic and healing it would be. And so when I first hired her, I said, I need to write this down. My life has just been insane, and I need to document it for me, for my family, maybe for a few friends. I said, but I do not want to publish it. I am not interested in publishing this. And so we start our work, and we move along through the first year, and now we're in the second year. It's just like, oh my God, your life is just crazy. Like, you really have to publish this book. And I would say, no, absolutely not. I'm not going to publish it. We move along through the second year. She's constantly pushing me to publish, and I'm constantly pushing back. We get into the beginning of the third year, and I finally said to myself, there could be a lot of healing for other people, and me sharing the things that I've been through might help people who are going through something similar. Although I don't think many people have had their employer try to kill them, but there are a lot of things, tragedies in my life that people can align with. And so perhaps it will help them. I decided my story needed to be told, and I agreed to publish it. And so we rounded it out after 3 years, and she helped me find a publisher. We published it last year. It won an award recently for nonfiction books. And so I'm very proud of that. And it's just been, it's really parlayed into opportunities like this for me to share my story, but really to focus on, here's my path to healing. And you also can take some of these steps to your path to healing. You don't have to get stuck in being a survivor, and your tragedy and your loss and your heartbreak and your adversity don't have to define you. You define you. And so you can recreate your life into peace and joy and happiness. And so it's been an incredible journey.